Hey guys, this is the third video in this series where I'm teaching kids,
Alright.
Oh boy.
Alright. 1, go.
Hey guys, this is the third video in this series where I'm teaching kids basic hand sewing. In this video, we're going to talk about buttons. Buttons are everywhere and knowing how to sew them on is super valuable because they fall off all the time. You're going to have to sew a lot of buttons in your life, so knowing the basics will come in handy. So there are actually 3 different types of buttons that you'll see most often. So the first kind, which I'll talk about just very briefly, is called a shank button. This is a shank button. It's got a totally flat, smooth surface on the front, and in the back it has a little loop attached, and you sew it on using this loop, and you attach it to the clothing. So shank buttons are not used very frequently anymore and typically only on fancier clothing. So knowing how to sew them on is great, but the more likely case is that you'll be finding either of the next 2 kinds of buttons. And these buttons are very similar except for one main difference. So this is a 2-hole button because on the front of it, it has 1, 2 holes. And this is a 4-hole button because on its front it has 1, 2, 3, 4 holes. And so today I'm going to be explaining the process of how to sew on both, but I'm going to be using the 4-hole button to demonstrate, as it's basically the same as a 2-hole button but with one extra step, so we can talk about both ways on one button. So for this, I'm going to use my same sewing supplies as earlier. So I've got my scissors, I've got a needle pre-threaded. So go ahead and pause the video here if you need to thread your needle. If not, then I'm just going to be using the same piece of fabric that I was using to practice my stitching earlier, and you can as well. So I have plenty of space over here to put my button onto. So I will be using this same piece. And we're going to start it off pretty much the same way we've started everything else. So this is the right side of my fabric, I can tell because there are no knots or anything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold on to my button, leaving at least 1 hole exposed. So just kind of pinching it and the fabric between my fingers. And then I'm going to go to the wrong side, and I'm going to kind of be looking at both roughly and just kind of trying to poke my needle through one of the holes. So then when you do get that, you can pull it up and you wait for the knot to catch, and you make sure it catches well with no loose threads around it or anything, and then you can pull it taut. And so now we have our button up here, and mine's kind of wiggling around, so I'm just going to recenter it and pinch it nice and tight, and then I'm going to poke down through the other hole, like diagonal from the one that we just came through. And I'm being very careful when I do that none of my fingers, while I'm pinching the button, are in a position where they're likely to get poked by my needle, because again, it is super, super sharp. Be careful. So now I have sort of a little diagonal line there out of my stitching. And we're just going to repeat that process a few times. So coming back, checking back and forth. Now you have your knot as kind of a guide to where that hole probably is. So it should be a little bit easier this time to come up through the same hole we did the first time, and then to come down through the hole we went down the last time. And you'll notice that now that my button is kind of secured, I can hold the button a little bit more loosely, or not even hold the button at all, because we've already gotten to the point where the stitches are holding it by itself. Just gonna get rid of that little loop there. Again, little loops, they're common, happen to all of us, just kind of. So what I'm doing to solve that problem is I'm kind of pulling up on the stitches here and down on them here. And it's starting to seem like I'm not going to be able to get rid of that loop. And that's okay. So I'm just going to leave it, and I'm just going to ignore it and pretend it's not there, the same way that I just ignore my knot. So then I'm going to keep doing that process of coming up through that top hole, making sure not to come through any of the other holes like I just did that time. See, now I'm struggling a little bit, and that's okay. There we go. So again, buttons are a little bit tricky because you do have one exact spot where you need the needle to go, and it won't go anywhere else. So sometimes it just takes stabbing it, re-stabbing it, re-stabbing it, and that's okay. And so now I've sewn over this about 3 or 4 times, and I think that's adequate. I think it's going to give me a nice tight hold in that direction. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to move to one of my other holes, and I'm going to move to this one up here in this corner. So to do that, I'm just going to flip it over, poke it where I think it might be, check, no, and then try again, and yes, I got it that time. And then pull it up through, and then we're going to create basically an X across the middle of our button. So I'm going to come down through the hole that doesn't have any thread in it right now, that other corner, and then pulling through, and then we're going to repeat that process a few times. So going down through that, up through that corner, and down through the other corner. And so now my button is completely sewn on. Now if this were a 2-hole button, we would have just stopped after that first row that we did. We wouldn't have had to make the X because we wouldn't have had 4 holes to make the X. So for a 2-hole button, you essentially just come up through one hole, down through the other, up through the first one, down through the second, over and over again, exactly like we did for the 4-hole, but just only once through. And so now I think that button is super tight on there. I can give it a tug and it is not going anywhere. So I'm going to flip over my fabric. I'm going to cut my needle loose, make a big circle, cut through it, pull my needle out and set it aside. And then right over left and through. And right over left and through. And once more for good measure, right over left and through. Simple knots. Pulling nice and tight, and then cutting off the excess. And I'm going to leave the little loop there so that it stays tight. So if you have any loopies anywhere on your project, don't cut them because it's going to make your stitching come unraveled. But like this, as we saw, like this is super tight and I'm not going to be able to take anything from it. So you can just leave it, just make sure to not cut through it. And like that, I have a nice, lovely button all sewn onto my fabric. And so should all of you. Congratulations, you guys just learned how to sew on buttons.